Should interest rates and mortgages be going up? When will the Windrush generation get justice? And should Parliament sanction Boris Johnson's allies? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Nick Fletcher, Labour Shadow Minister Sarah Owen, journalist and author Tomiwa Owolade and Nadine Batchelor-Hunt from Politics Home. Today, the Bank of England has just raised interest rates to 5%. How much pain will that cause homeowners and renters?
If I have clients coming to me on a 2-year fix that they took 2 years ago, and I'm suggesting it's £300-400 a month extra on a mortgage payment, then there's some shock.
We'll speak to an economist who says high interest rates won't stop rising prices.
Arrivals at Tilbury. The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans. Many are ex-servicemen who know England. They serve this country well.
We'll be live at Tilbury in Essex, where the Empire Windrush arrived 75 years ago. My guest, Tomiwa Owolade, argues that race relations in Britain shouldn't be seen through an American prism.
Is it thought that this House, when it comes to a conclusion, must be obeyed?
And is Parliament about to sanction MPs who criticise that report into Boris Johnson? Let's start with that breaking news. You can see here the Bank of England has just increased the interest rate to 5%. It's gone up 0.5%. It was predicted a 0.25% rise, but following those inflation figures stuck at 8.7%, it's gone for the full 0.5%. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Nick, is the pain this will undoubtedly cause people necessary? Just a reference, in 1989, you'll remember the then Chancellor John Major facing double-digit inflation and a 15% bank rate, said that the harsh truth is that if the policy isn't hurting, it isn't working. We cannot and must not fudge the determination to stop inflation in its tracks. Is he right, and is it right now?
It's very difficult, but obviously it's one tool that the Bank of England, in fact, I believe it's really the only tool that the Bank of England have got to try and curb inflation. Inflation affects everybody, and it's something that we've got to get control of. The government obviously have set an inflation target of 2%. The Bank of England's job is to try and get to that point, and obviously they are putting their interest rates up to try and achieve that.
So it is necessary?
I do think it is necessary to get the inflation where it needs to be. I do think that you could probably hold off a little bit. I do think interest rates take time to take effect, and there's people who are on fixed mortgages where it's not actually taking effect, but will do in a few months' time.
All right, well, we'll come back to some of the detail, but broadly speaking, is this pain necessary in order to bring down inflation, Sarah?
After 13 years of a Tory government, this is the pain, the reality that people are suffering. We shouldn't be in this place in the first place. I mean, we had 4 different chancellors in the space of 4 months, and they crashed the economy, and that is why we are here.
You wouldn't be here, of course. I realise that you wouldn't use this as a starting position, but we are here now. You also agree it's necessary and there's nothing government can do. I
think that government could be doing a lot more to help people with the impacts.
Different, but in terms of
the impacts of what's happening right now and the real cost of this inflation. £1,000 more on a shopping budget, mortgages going through the roof, people facing repossessions. This is the reality of the 13 years of Tory mismanagement of our economy, and we're all paying the price.
Is it a necessary evil?
I can't see any alternative to it. The striking thing is that by next year, according to the Resolution Foundation, 800,000 people would need to remortgage their homes. The amount that people would need to pay for the mortgages next year would also increase by £300. And what's also striking is that Rishi Sunak promised to halve inflation this year, and clearly that's not going to be the case anymore.
You don't think that will happen? It's not achievable?
I don't think so. I don't think so. And I think it just illustrates again that one of the main planks of Rishi Sunak's attempt to be Prime Minister was economic stability and bringing the economy back on track, but that's clearly not the case
well,
now.
and that may well have political implications, of course, at the general election when that happens. Is it a necessary evil? Is this the pain we have to go through to bring down inflation?
I mean, so far it feels a little bit like these interest rates have been a blunt instrument because inflation is still remaining incredibly sticky. I mean, Rishi Sunak's promise to half inflation by the end of the year should have been quite straightforward. You know, we're comparing it against a higher base. You know, the increase from this time last year is going to naturally be smaller.
Except he doesn't seem to have any levers at his disposal.
Well, this is a situation now, so you have to wonder, first of all, if this is working with the Bank of England and whether or not there needs to be a kind of rethink. But also, the government needs to start thinking about what it can do to mitigate these consequences of these things. Well, that's the only kind of, right now, in the immediate situation, it feels like that's the only way that people can be helped really immediately.
Well, let me show you headlines here in the Times. First of all, triggering recession could tame inflation. So that could be the pain that people have to endure. Chancellor's advisers, though, claim bank misjudged crisis. I don't know if that's how you feel, Nick, about it. I'll ask you in a moment. But that's also because yesterday on the Today programme, interview with Karen Ward, a member of that committee of advisers to Jeremy Hunt, said that actually they should have created what she says fear earlier. They came to this too late. And then the Tories turn on bank over rates crisis. Again, your colleague, Dame Andrea Leadsom, has accused the bank of doing too little, too late. Is she right?
Yes, I think she is, and I think the general view is that. I mean, there's only so many things that the bank can actually do, and putting the interest rates up is one of them, and they should have done it probably several months earlier. And if they'd have done that, it would have helped. Obviously, we still needed to go through it, but I think we've had 13 interest rate rises consecutively, and it's causing an awful lot of hardship.
I mean, Rishi Sunak has come out very strongly supporting, as has the Chancellor, because the Bank of England is independent of government, a decision taken by Gordon Brown in '97, and that should stay the case, should it?
Well, as I say, I mean, it's difficult if it's not independent and it becomes political. So yes, it probably is that. But obviously, they should be able to stand up to criticism when they've got things wrong. Well, and it's quite clearly, I believe, that they've actually got this. They've got this.
Do you think they've got it wrong? Do you have criticism of the Bank of England?
I think we were right to make it independent. Of course, there can be criticism, but I think it is absolutely inherent that this should be independent. The Bank of England should remain independent because goodness knows where we would be.
But are you critical of the way they've handled it?
I think that we need to look at that. I'm more critical of the way government have handled it, to be honest. I am really wholeheartedly in damning consequences that are going to be faced. And it says there, triggering a recession, that's what the Tories are trying to do. That's more pain. That is more pain for working people that are already suffering. And they could be acting now, particularly around mortgage support. What we should be seeing is getting lenders being able to switch to interest-only rates.
They
and
can
to be
already
able
do
to,
that.
And to make lenders wait a minimum of 6 months before initiating
the Labour package. I think the government's going to do something similar.
Well, Martin Lewis has said quite clearly that he hopes that the government takes on the package of measures. Well, but quite frankly, we are constantly having to tidy up your mess, and people are fed up with it.
I think that's a ridiculous statement after your last Chancellor, when you were in power, sold off all the gold and left us a note saying there was no money left.
13 years. And
we had 5 years of austerity to put your mess right. That's what's happened. Then obviously we came into government in 2015. We're on a track to get things where we want them to be. And obviously we've had Brexit, we've had COVID, and we've had a war in Ukraine. So I think to say that your fiscal policies are going to help this country, then I don't think so. Well, socialism doesn't work anywhere. Well, never has done and never will do.
Well, let's talk to somebody who is also critical of the Bank of England, albeit for different reasons. Richard Murphy, Professor of Accounting Practice at Sheffield University. Welcome to you. How much pain is this rate rise going to cause people?
It's going to cause a massive amount of pain. It will take time if people are on fixed rate mortgages, but it's going to hit mortgage borrowers eventually very hard indeed. I was on a discussion on Radio 5 this morning where somebody had seen their mortgage go up from £350 a month to over £1,000 a month and had no idea how to pay that. But let's also be clear, it hits people who rent very hard because rents are now directly related to interest rates because most landlords are in the private sector, which was not the case when we had previous serious bouts of inflation when most people rented from councils. It's also going to hit business very hard. And this is really why I'm so critical of this policy. This is a disaster, this 0.5% increase. The rate's already too high, and this is just making everything worse. After 13 attempts to control inflation with interest rate rises, the Bank of England is trying to do so yet again. It's a bit like Einstein's definition of insanity. Keep doing the same thing and hoping the outcome will be different. But that's what the bank is doing. It won't be different. And the reason why...
Yes, that's what I want to... Yeah, why won't it? Why does raising interest rates lead to higher inflation? Because that does go against the sort of orthodoxy that you have to suck demand out of the economy, and raising interest rates does that.
Well, no, the orthodoxy was written in the 1970s when we last had serious inflation. Yes, we had some in 1990-ish as well, but the serious inflation was in the 70s. That was when this orthodoxy was written. And then the economy was utterly different from now. First of all, the amount of money people borrowed on mortgages was much lower, and there weren't the feedback loops of the sort I've just explained on rent, but also on car leases and inside many products which actually are heavily interest related. For example, water. 1/4 of the costs of water in the UK relate to interest costs by water companies. They will go up dramatically, probably threefold as a result of interest rises, and that will be passed straight on to us in inflation again.
Right.
So the feedback loop that we have in our economy is not a wage price spiral. We actually have an interest price spiral, which in most companies is going to be much more costly than the increase in the wage rate. And the Bank of England seems to be completely unaware of this.
What would your solution be then to trying to bring down inflation, as Rishi Sunak has pledged to do?
Well, the first thing I would do is stop doing something that clearly doesn't work, which is increasing interest rates. It doesn't work, it hasn't worked, and it won't work because of the reasons I've just explained. It is actually increasing inflation. I would have done nothing today, and I'm very interested. The 6 men on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee voted for an increase. Of the 3 women, 2 voted to keep the rate the same, which is exactly what I would have done. So there is support for my argument. We didn't need a rate rise today.
Right. So would you like to have seen the government? Would you have liked to have seen the government block this, whether through sort of, you know, soft back channels as such, but sort of indicate to the Bank of England they didn't want to see another rate rise?
Oh, let's be clear. The Bank of England can be overruled by the government whenever it likes.
And would you
this
have liked
idea
to...
that hang on, the Bank of England is not independent of the government. Read Section 19 of the Bank of England Act, 1998, and it says the government can always overrule the Bank of England. And so should
they have done on this case, Richard? That's what I'm saying. Should they have... Right, OK,
yes.
well, hang on, stay with us. Let's go to the panel. Do you think that is what the government should have indicated? Do you agree with what you've heard from Richard there, Nick?
I agree that the interest rates shouldn't have gone up today. I do think we need to... the interest rates have gone up. We need to have some time to let these increased interest rates actually take effect before we put them up again. So I would personally wait at least 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Let some of these people come off these mortgage deals that they're on already. The pain will obviously take place then. Then inflation will start to drop, and then we can start looking forward again. But to continually keep on putting them up without actually seeing the effect is very, very difficult to do. And the small amount of people that are actually paying are paying desperately at this moment in time.
Sarah, what do you make of what Richard said?
I think that if there was going to be a decision to block a decision or an interest rate rise from the Bank of England, then that should come to Parliament and that should be taken democratically. But whether we have this or not, the government should have been ready with a package of measures to support the people that are going to be hit the hardest.
The packages of measures is that you undo the work that the bank are actually trying to do.
No,
the bank are trying to do that to slow down spending. So then if the government put money in, then it'll increase spending. So you're just literally going to guess. What we need to do is slow down the interest rate increases and let them take effect. Yes, there's pain. There's always pain in this situation.
There's been too many people having to deal with that pain, and it's not been the likes of you and your cabinet.
It's futile putting the interest rates up to cause reduction in inflation and then give money which will cause an increase in inflation.
What are you going to tell your constituents? Because it has gone up by 0.5%. So are you going to say you've got to bear more pain?
I think that they shouldn't have to bear more pain. I think that we should be able to see a change of government or have government act to help them deal with that pain, because I don't believe that overall interest rates will increase or inflation will increase with targeted short-term temporary support to stop people losing their homes, and that is what we're offering.
What do you make of the call from Richard Murphy to intervene, if you like, from the government with the Bank of England's decision?
I think he makes a really good argument in terms of increasing interest rates could actually worsen inflation. And we also have to remember that we're putting pressure on people's household budgets when they've already had really, really high inflation. There's already so much pressure on people. I mean, the levels of poverty in this country are rising at the moment, the amount of people in debt because they can't afford to pay their bills, that's going to be hit as well. So I do wonder, you know, how many times we're going to have these interest rate rises. You know, what if this one doesn't work? Are we going to have another one and then another one? At what point will the government kind of take a more hands-on approach? And now I understand why the independence of the Bank of England is important. You made a really good point about, you know, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. We don't know what would have happened there if it wasn't independent. But I also think, you know, if this doesn't start working soon, I think everybody in the country is going to start saying, please do something else because we can't take any more.
Well, I mean, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister rejected the idea of direct help, Tomawa, in terms of helping people pay their bills. They are going to do something similar. Labour's going further, requiring lenders to actually take some measures to ease the payment. But you will have to pay it back at some point if you've got a mortgage or a loan out. Do you think the government should be intervening more directly?
Yeah, I think they should. They should be, as Sarah said, have a more targeted approach. And I think one thing I'd also like to emphasise is that I think there's a tendency to see inflation as Rishi Sunak put it, as a global macroeconomic issue. But inflation is actually higher in France. I mean, it's actually lower in France and Italy
in the Eurozone
and Germany
in America.
And in America as well. So it's very much a domestic issue, and we should
No, that's not true. I mean, inflation's high everywhere. It's not just a UK.
Yeah, but it is
issue.
higher here.
It's higher in the UK.
It may be slightly higher, but we're all struggling with the same thing. There's been an oversupply of money and there's been a lack of goods. They've had a war in Ukraine. It's obviously put prices up, and obviously wages have tried to follow that, and we end up in a cycle where we increase wages, inflation goes up, we increase wages, inflation goes up. We've got to keep a lid on it.
Yeah.
And that's
I would argue the wage argument, that the idea that increasing wages is worsening inflation when wages are increasing below inflation, I don't think really holds water. And I think if you look at the margins that large companies are making in terms of profit and how wages have stagnated, I think I saw a statistic that in real terms wages are the same as they were in 2005 or something. The idea that
certainly
wages
since 2010
are pushing,
they've stagnated.
Yeah, the idea that wages are pushing inflation when we're seeing this increase in profits of these big companies, I struggle to see how that fully holds water given the current economic landscape.
I mean, there's been a contradiction. The government has continually said these are external factors that have been influencing inflation and driving higher prices. But if that was the case, why keep increasing interest rates? Now there is discussion that there is a bit more domestic inflation coming into the system, but not necessarily as a result of wage increases as yet. But let's go back to Richard. I mean, Richard, some of your ideas were taken on by Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party, informed some of his economic plan. But do you think either party now, Richard, is going to listen to anything other than what they're both doing at the moment?
Well, let's be clear, I wasn't a member of the Labour Party when Jeremy used my ideas.
No, I didn't say that.
So I'm
I
not
just said
taking
they
a party
informed. I just said I
political.
informed.
No, I'm just making a non-party political line. The point I'm saying is that actually the economics that underpins this, the Bank of England's economics, is simply wrong. It was created in another era. It doesn't understand the world we now live in, where interest rates are built into prices. And the people who are punished are borrowers. But actually, borrowers did not create inflation. Companies create inflation. And very much so, it's large companies that create inflation. They are not being penalised. Let me give you a simple example of what happened at 12 o'clock today. The banks in the UK, the commercial banks, increased their income in the next year by £4.5 billion, which is the extra interest they will be paid by the government in the next year as a consequence of this. We are running an inflation policy that is welfare for the rich, welfare for the banks, and welfare for large companies. And they should be made to make the contributions that are required to redress that situation. The penalty should not fall on people in poverty or who are going to be forced into poverty by this. The policy is completely wrong. It won't work.
Well, if Richard is right, do you agree, Nick, that you are pointlessly inflicting pain on your constituents?
Well, it's not me that's doing it. It's not the government that's doing it. It's the Bank of England that's doing it.
Yeah, but you agree with that broadly, you might not have wanted this rise, is the right strategy. But do you agree it will, if he's right, and you may think he's wrong, but if he's right, do you agree it will pointlessly inflict pain on your constituents?
Oh, no, I don't think it pointlessly inflicts pain. It's inflation that we're trying to keep down. I believe that's the Bank of England are trying to do that, and that's what we need. Inflation, as painful as these interest rates are, rampant inflation is far, far worse.
Sarah?
I think that there is a big question here as to why it is that it is the worst in the UK as compared to everywhere else, and look at what it is that we are doing so wrong and so differently compared to everywhere else, and learn from those lessons. Because ultimately, when we keep saying, well, there's going to be more pain, where's the gain for people? After 13 years, no one feels any better off. No one feels that that pain is going to be paying off for anything other than just more poverty.
But would you challenge the Bank of England?
I think we've got to look at how we can support people now. As much as we can have this economic argument about the Bank of England and their independence, right now people are really scared about losing their homes. And that's what I want to deal with immediately.
All right, well, we've had an economic argument. Richard Murphy, thank you very much for joining us today on the programme. It's 75 years since the Empire Windrush docked at the port of Tilbury in Essex on the 21st of June 1948. Our correspondent who's there, Ashita Nagesh, can talk to us. Hello to you, Ashita. Tell us about the Caribbean migrants who arrived in Britain at that time.
Well, there were hundreds of Caribbean migrants on board the Windrush, and they were the first of what we now know as the Windrush Generation. Many of them had served for the British Army in World War II. And when they came here, they came to retrain as engineers, as nurses in the newly formed NHS. Many of them worked as bus drivers. They were filling post-war labour shortages. And one of the many events that's happening across the country is here at the port of Tilbury, as you said, which is where the ship first docked on the 21st. And those passengers came into the UK and took those first steps into Britain on the 22nd. And now just a few metres away, people are inside having a dance, having a drink. But here, I wanted to show you, this is the spot where the Empire Windrush docked 75 years ago. Now, of course, the Windrush Generation, it was not always the warmest welcome when they came here, and they have faced hardships in the years since. Of course, most notably in the last 5 years, the name Windrush has become synonymous with scandal and injustice, because so many of those people who were legally allowed to live and work here, when they came here, they were British subjects, of course, coming from countries that were under British rule, and then they were given that permission to live and work here permanently in the 70s. They were not given proof of that, and so years later they were then denied housing, denied employment, denied access to benefits, and many were deported or detained. Now, fresh figures from the Home Office have also shown that of 6,348 applications to their compensation scheme for victims of the scandal, only 1,681, that's about a quarter, have actually been paid. And there are over 2,000 people still waiting for a decision.
OK.
There have also been growing calls from other groups like Human Rights Watch for that compensation scheme to be taken out of the Home Office's control and given to an independent body. Now, the Home Office told me in a statement that it's paid or offered more than £75 million to victims of the scandal, and that it's committed to righting the wrongs of the Windrush scandal.
All right, Ashita Nagesh there in Tilbury. Thank you very much. And yes, those commemorative events will continue throughout the day. Nadine, your grandparents were part of the Windrush Generation. What was their experience?
So I think one of the things that people don't talk about when it comes to the Windrush Generation is a lot of people were promised that they would be given jobs that matched the skills they had when they were in the Caribbean. In my family's case, my grandmother came over and he was made a bus driver, and he was a highly skilled worker. So that was one of the things that people don't talk about very much, is that a lot of people were led over here on kind of false pretences. But the impact and the contributions that the Windrush Generation have made to the UK are immense. My grandfather set up the Birmingham Racial Attacks Monitoring Unit when he was here. He was active in local politics. He was a Labour Party member, and he obviously made the UK his home. He had many children, and I'm one of his grandchildren. I'm incredibly proud, and I think it's one thing kind of recognising their contributions to the NHS, etc. But we also have to recognise that there was that false pretense, and also people experienced a lot of racism when they arrived here. I mean, it wasn't just them. They'd gone from a country where they didn't experience racism because everyone was black to the UK, where they were told it was the motherland and that they'd be welcome with open arms, and they weren't. And then their children faced racism. I mean, my dad used to get chased home by racists, and you know, I remember he told me that he was looking for a job and he'd go to a shop that had an advertisement in the window and he'd go in and they'd say, not for you. So we really need to think about this as a holistic thing and not just focus on the positive, people came over. What happened next? And I think that's something we need to also talk about.
Has that generation, listening to Nadine with the experience of her own grandparents, has justice been delivered for the Windrush generation, particularly after what happened in 2018, when many people who didn't have the documents through no fault of their own found themselves exposed to Home Office rules and many were deported?
Justice has clearly not been delivered to them, if only a quarter of them have received the financial compensation that they rightly deserved. And I think what makes the Windrush scandal especially painful and especially bitter for them is, as Nadine rightly put it, Britain was seen as the motherland. Britain was seen as the place you go to better yourselves. And even amongst the people that were on Empire Windrush, they had a great patriotic sensibility, which has been soured, unfortunately, by their experience of racism. But I would also say that I think it would do a disservice to that generation and to subsequent Black British people to completely define their experiences solely in terms of racism.
Well, we'll discuss a little bit more. We can see pictures here of the Empire Windrush, which landed where Ashita was standing there at Tilbury Docks, helping to rebuild Britain after the war. Do you think justice has been delivered, Nick?
Well, obviously we're not there yet, are we? Just from what you've said there, I mean, it is a stain on our history, the way that people were treated, and it's not something that that should be taken lightly at all. And we need to learn from these mistakes.
Do people need to be compensated immediately now? The full number, I can't remember the total, but if it's 1,681, that's a quarter. If we're talking about 5,000 or so people, should they be compensated immediately?
We have to remember some of them have died as well.
Yeah, of course.
There are people that have died, and you know, people had healthcare withdrawn, like cancer treatments and things like that. So there are people who will never.
And some of them deported.
And many deported. But you know,
and this generation are in their 70s and 80s now. You know, they cannot continue to wait forever.
We need to be moving much quicker on this. It's as simple as that. There's no two ways about it.
I mean, the Home Office says £75 million has so far been paid out to victims through this scheme. The Home Office not known for its efficiency when it comes to bureaucracy. Is that part of the problem, that it is sort of, you might say, cock-up rather than conspiracy?
Well, I think the Home Office delays are really compounding the injustices that have already taken place. And also, I think the lack of trust, because it was the Home Office that had this scandal, that was responsible for it, was at the heart of it. And I agree that we should be taking the Windrush compensation scheme out of the Home Office, because it's about efficiency, but it's also about trust as well. And I think if we're talking about the injustices, we're not just talking about the compensation, we're also about what about future generations, so that the experiences of Nadine's granddad isn't going to be seen by future generations as well. I think we've got to look at this as a whole. And yes, we've got to see the wonderful contributions and make that a proper celebration. But until those injustices are righted, it's always going to be bittersweet.
Right. Well, I mean, this headline, just finally, Nadine, in The Independent, hundreds of Windrush victims waiting over a year for the compensation on the callous scheme we've been talking about. But actually, if we go back in time to the 1960s, when you were talking about your grandparents working, hundreds with chronic and mental illness sent back to the Caribbean, then in the 1960s, this was under the Wilson government, that's only just been unearthed now by the BBC, previously classified documents that reveal that at least 400 or so Commonwealth citizens, mainly from the Caribbean, were wrongly deported in the 1950s and early 1970s, and that's just come to light now.
I mean, it doesn't shock me. The way in which people of colour from Commonwealth countries were treated at that time was horrendous anyway. You know, the way people were treated in the colonies and in the century before that. You know, we have to be honest. In many ways, the UK did welcome these people, but they were also sources of economic growth. They were workers. They weren't just seen as people and to enrich British culture, which, as a proud person of Jamaican heritage, I believe the food and the music is much better for our influence. But, they were also seen as kind of economic workers. And that's another reason when you see people were led over here on false pretences. So I think there's so many people that haven't received justice, and there's so much hurt about this in the Afro-Caribbean community that there is just no reason for this not to have been dealt with by now. And every day that goes by is another risk of another Windrush victim dying. It's more stress for these families that have been tied up in the legal system trying to get this sorted out. So if Windrush Day, the 75th anniversary of the Windrush arriving is going to mean anything, the government really just needs to get this sorted as soon as possible. The wait is just absurd.
Are you also not surprised? It's been going on for decades, actually, so these documents have uncovered, not just in the last 5 years or so.
No, I am sadly not surprised, and it really does. I think that there will be more people that will die without seeing the justice that is deserved to them and to their families. And it's something to say that this should be a priority for the government. Really, it should, because we have got a very small, narrow time limit now where people can actually see that justice and be able to enjoy that justice as well.
All right, well, let's talk to Tomo about his book. It's out today. This is Not America. In it, you argue about many things, but broadly that we see race issues in the UK too much through an American lens. What do you mean by that, and why is it a problem?
So in my book, I argue two things. The first thing is that all too often we see racism and race in the UK through an American perspective. And this came to light to me in the summer of 2020 during the George Floyd protests. And I saw some people using a term called BIPOC, which is an acronym for Black, Indigenous, People of Colour, to refer to Black and ethnic minority people in the UK. Now, that term would make sense in America because America's indigenous communities have obviously been oppressed and discriminated against. But using BIPOC in a British context carries with it a more far-right resonance than a sort of progressive agenda.
And what does what's that meant in sort of reality in terms of dealing with race relations here?
It means that it obscures the actual conditions of Black people in the UK. And what I found whilst talking to people about race is the level of ignorance, actually, about Black people and other ethnic minority people in the UK. So I also argue in my book that we should have a more diverse understanding of diversity. So just to give one example, 25 years ago, the majority of Black people in the UK were Black Caribbean people. But as of today, the majority of Black people are now Black Africans. So over the past 25 years, due to immigration, there's been a huge shift in the composition of Black British people, but I don't think that's been acknowledged or incorporated enough into discussions about race, because there are important differences between those two groups, especially in terms of education.
Right. Well, when it comes to disparities within the ethnic minority communities, Nadine, you will know the report carried out by Tony Sewell, I can't remember exactly when, but a couple of years ago, that structural racism was not the cause of many of the disparities experienced by ethnic minorities, and the institutional racism, while, yes, was there perhaps in the police force, for example, but couldn't be identified across the board. Do you agree with that?
No, that was a conclusion that I think has widely been debunked, and I know people who have who were working in government at the time that the definition that the government were working with on institutional racism was kind of one they were kind of coming up with themselves and weren't really engaging with the fact, if you're Black in the UK, you are over 50% of Black children in the UK live in poverty. Now, that's not a coincidence. That is a consequence of a socio-economic system that has resulted in Black children being poorer. And I really agree with you on the point about the kind of demographic of Black people and how it has become more African over the last 25 years. Because, for example, you're more likely to be poor if you're Afro-Caribbean than if you are African in the UK. And that's because, in some ways, that's because the Windrush generation came over in a very different socio-economic context than later kind of immigration from countries like Africa. So they have seen a kind of longer intergenerational impact of structural racism than, Black people that may have arrived later to the UK.
But do you think importing the sort of terminology and perhaps some of the background from America hasn't been helpful to the discussion?
I completely agree with you on the BIPOC thing. I mean, I find it absurd when people are saying things like Black, Indigenous and people of colour in the UK. So I do think we need to be careful about that. I think, the chattel slavery we saw in America, just isn't the same situation here. I think there is a bit of a lack of education about the British role in slavery, but it manifested itself completely differently. But one thing I will say is, you know, as of the last statistics I checked, the UK has more black people by a percentage of population in prison than America. So there are those kind of parallels and similarities, but fundamentally, black British people and where they come from are completely different to black Americans, and I think it's really important that we remember that. So I completely agree with you on that one.
But what about, you also say that class, you think class is more of an issue for black people, ethnic minority people here, than racism?
And this was clear to me after looking back at my education. So I went to a state comprehensive school in southeast London, and the striking thing about that experience was that the white working class kids were friends with ethnic minority kids of all backgrounds. And the white middle class kids in my school were friends with ethnic minority kids of all backgrounds. But the white working class kids and the white middle class kids were not friends with each other. And I think that all too often when we talk about the inequalities in society, class isn't mentioned sufficiently enough. And I think class is still one of the main dividing lines in the UK.
Nadine?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But I think the way in which racism manifests itself is by socioeconomic disenfranchisement. So inherently, the fact that we have this kind of structural racism is because black people are poorer. You know, as I said, over 50% of black children in the UK live in poverty. That is a horrifying statistic. The idea that there isn't some kind of structural, if you're saying it's not structural, then you're kind of placing the blame on black people, indirectly. So I think it's really important to remember that. And also, in our education systems, I think, as we were touching on with black Caribbean and black African people, the attainment gap, I think, is also something that's important to look at, because I did my dissertation on the experiences of people of colour at the University of Cambridge, and one of the things that you see is that people from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds, most commonly mixed race people from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds, have the lowest achievement. And why is that? Where is that coming from? So there are those really important disparities that we have to get into on a more granular level.
And just to go back to that, black Caribbean pupils in schools are 3 times more likely to be excluded than black African pupils. And I argue in my book that if we genuinely care about the inequalities in our society, we need to be more specific in our focus rather than making generalisations.
Sarah, what do you make of what you've heard? And this idea that class, as Tomowa says, is actually more important, perhaps, than racism itself?
Do you know what, for a start, it's wonderful to be able to listen to both of you and be able to hear that and have that discussion in front of us. And I think that we would benefit much more for children, for older people, for the way our public sector and our organisations work, if we have these conversations, but we don't just have them once a year, that they are much wider, much more widespread. And we have that deeper understanding of the diversity within our society, because you're absolutely right. I don't think we do, particularly of the mixed race experience as well, and the experience of the different immigration generations. What our first generation immigrants wanted is going to be very different from the experience that we have now. And I think that conversation needs to be had. It needs to be had frankly. It's not always comfortable, but we suffer if we don't.
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, now you spoke about people in prison. 94% of the prison population are men. So, I mean, there's a huge issue there that we need to deal with. I think the Sewell report talked about white working class boys are the ones that are actually being left behind.
This was from an educational point of view, yes.
I come from a working class background, so I think the fantastic thing about this country is that you can achieve anything if we all really work hard. Obviously, there's been huge issues in the past. We need to learn from them, but we need to make sure all the opportunities are there for everybody to take, and I think that's a really important thing for us to do.
What did you make of the taking the knee debate and discussion? We can show you here, Keir Starmer, we kneel with all those opposing anti-black racism, Black Lives Matter. Obviously, that was the movement that started, and taking the knee was very much the symbol, if you like, across sort of sporting events at the time, but became a globalised system, but caused an awful lot of controversy. What did you make when you saw that picture of Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, the Deputy Leader?
Yeah, I can perfectly understand why it's done. It's done as an expression of solidarity.
Yeah.
But I think the risk with things like taking the knee is that it becomes performative. It becomes merely a symbolic gesture without actually trying to resolve the material issues that affect black and brown people. And one thing that struck me about the World Cup last year was that when the England national team played the American national team, the England players took the knees, but the American players did not. And I found that striking. And I think that's a sort of illustrates my points that all too often we follow America rather than trying to focus on issues that pertain to our own country.
Sarah?
I think you're absolutely right. If it remains a symbol, the solidarity is lost because you need action as well. And I think that it's really important that we want to bring forward a Race Equality Act that will be led with Baroness Lawrence, but also addressing some of the financial disparities that Nadine talked about around making sure there's an equality impact assessment for every single major fiscal event, and also introducing an ethnicity pay gap, mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting, because we know the disparities are huge and we need to shine a light on them so that we can actually tackle them.
All right, let's move on, because on Monday, you'll remember the Commons voted overwhelmingly backing the Privileges Committee report, which said that Boris Johnson had deliberately misled MPs in the House of Commons. Now, some of his biggest supporters believe that their free speech is under attack because they spoke out in quite colourful terms, some of them, about the inquiry and the system that was used to scrutinise Boris Johnson. Let's have a listen to this.
Is it thought that this House, when it comes to a conclusion, must be obeyed? Is it the case that we must not criticise the Dangerous Dogs Act because it was passed by this great and noble House? Or are we in fact allowed to criticise as a fundamental of free speech that which happens to us, that which is reported about us, that which is said of us?
Attacks by honourable members on other honourable members designed to preempt the committee's findings frustrate the will of the House, erode public confidence and thereby undermine our democracy. They may themselves be contempt of the House because they are attempting to impede the functioning of the House. We will be doing a further report to the House on this shortly, inviting consideration of what could be done to prevent this happening in the future.
Harriet Harman, who chaired the committee of that report. Are you expecting, Nick, to be mentioned in Harriet Harman's report when she looks at those who criticise committee, because you did too?
I don't think I particularly criticised the committee. I didn't agree with the finding of the committee after sitting and listening to a debate, and surely that's what members of Parliament are meant to do. I said I would read the report. I did read much of the report. I wrote a speech to say that I was actually going to abstain, and then when I sat in the debate and I listened to many members, but mainly Sir Bill Cash, who was an experienced lawyer and an extremely experienced member of Parliament, and what he had to say about the report, and therefore I didn't agree with his findings.
Should people be sanctioned? Do you agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg that actually it will undermine freedom of speech if MPs like yourself are criticised for having done so?
Yeah, I think it would be free speech, and especially being able to speak in the chamber. We have parliamentary privilege. We can say things in there that obviously maybe not able or as easy to say outside of that. We should be able to do that. And what's the point of having a debate if we can't?
All right, Sarah?
I think that this is up for the point of the committee. It's not for us to decide around this. And I think that, you know, why do you think that Jacob Rees-Mogg and yourself shouldn't adhere to the same rules that everybody else does in Parliament? I think this goes to the fundamental problem of the Tories right now. They think that they can just ride roughshod over the rules that everybody else has to. And that report showed that Boris Johnson partied, lied to Parliament, lied to the Queen, and you voted against that. And it just is beggars belief.
Nick. You've got 10 seconds.
No, as I say, I refer people to what Sir Bill Cash had to say, and people need to make their own judgment.
So he was an idiot, not a liar.
It's all we have time for. There'll be Politics UK tomorrow at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer, and of course Politics Live on Monday at 12:15. From all of us here, bye-bye.